Before the rise of kings and the return of glory, there was a woman who tried to silence a promise. She wore a crown not given by God, ruled a kingdom soaked in fear, and nearly destroyed the royal bloodline of David. This is not just a story of betrayal, it's a story of survival, of one hidden child, one bold priest, and a God who never forgets his covenant. You're about to witness one of the most chilling and powerful stories in the Bible, the story of Athaliah, the queen who tried to kill a kingdom. If this powerful biblical retelling moves your heart, make sure to subscribe to this channel. We bring you soul-stirring stories, prayers, and spiritual insights every week. The sun over Samaria blazed hot, casting long shadows across the palace corridors where Athaliah had once walked as a girl, proud, calculating, and feared. Born of wicked royalty, her mother was the infamous Jezebel, high priestess of Baal, and the most reviled queen in the northern kingdom of Israel. Her father was Ahab, king of Israel, who had surrendered his soul to idols and dark counsel. From birth, Athaliah was no stranger to blood and ambition. She had seen how kingdoms rise and fall, not by sword alone, but by whispers in corridors, eyes behind curtains, and the stroke of a pen. Her heart, even in youth, beat not with innocence, but with a fire for control. When she was wed to Jehoram, son of Judah's king Jehoshaphat, it was not out of love nor diplomacy, it was strategy. A union forged to strengthen ties between Israel and Judah, though it would ultimately invite corruption into the house of David. Jehoram, a man once noble, became a puppet in her hands, enthralled by her confidence and deceived by her cunning. Athaliah brought with her the gods of her mother, Baal and Asherah. She lit their altars in Judah, just as Jezebel had in Israel. Sacred groves replaced the sacred law. The temple of the Lord was neglected while idols rose high on hills once consecrated to Yahweh. And Jehoram, who had once walked in the path of his grandfather Asa, turned his back on righteousness. He murdered his own brothers, eliminating any competition for the throne. It was a move whispered into his ear by none other than Athaliah. She was the serpent in the garden of Judah, coiled around the throne, beating poison into the crown. As the years passed, Jehoram's reign turned bitter. God struck him with an incurable disease, a slow, humiliating decay from within. His death brought little mourning to the people. Even the Chronicles of the Kings would later note, he departed with no one's regret. But to Athaliah, Jehoram's death was merely a shifting of power, not a loss. Her son Ahaziah, young and impulsive, took the throne, and she took the reins behind the scenes. Ahaziah had inherited his mother's thirst for dominance and his grandfather Ahab's disregard for God. Though the kingdom was called Judah, the land of God's covenant, the soul of Israel's corruption now ruled from its capital. Under Ahaziah, Baal worship thrived. Priests of the Most High God were silenced. The people wandered, confused between loyalty to tradition and fear of their rulers. The true worship of Yahweh was pushed into corners, surviving only in hidden hearts and quiet homes. But power, once grasped too tightly, often shatters. In a sudden twist of fate, Ahaziah was slain, not by enemy hands alone, but by divine orchestration. Caught in the chaos of war, he met his end in the northern lands after visiting his uncle Jehoram of Israel. Both kings fell within days, and messengers returned with grim news. The throne of Judah was empty, the crown had fallen, and in the hollow chamber of grief, Athaliah heard not sorrow, but opportunity. She did not weep, she did not stagger. She rose. The queen mother, already seasoned in cruelty, saw what others missed. With the king dead and his heirs mere children, the path to power stood clear. Her decision would shock the nation and shake the heavens. She would not grieve, she would reign. The palace gates groaned as they closed. What should have been a period of mourning became a stage of movement, silent, swift, and deadly. In the stillness following her son Ahaziah's death, Athaliah moved like a shadowed storm. The people waited, expecting a funeral procession, a mother's tears, a prince to be crowned in place of the fallen king. Instead, they heard screaming, not the cries of grief, but the cries of infants, children, and caretakers, echoing through palace walls. Athaliah had given the unthinkable command: kill all the royal heirs. It wasn't an act of panic, it was cold calculation. The lineage of David was a threat. The promise of God to preserve David's line forever was a prophecy she intended to erase. She had seen how power slipped through fingers when too many hands reached for it. One child was enough to undo her, so she ordered the death of every male descendant in the royal household, her grandsons, nephews, and cousins of Ahaziah. Little boys with chubby fingers and soft eyes, toddlers who had once played at her feet, infants born of the sacred line, all of them doomed. The palace became a house of weeping. Blood was spilled on marble floors where kings had once danced. Cradles stood empty. Mothers wailed in silence, too afraid to cry aloud. The royal lineage of Judah was being snuffed out like candles in a storm. And then, silence. Athaliah stood over the throne like a lioness over a kill. No one dared speak. No one dared ask who was next. The nation gasped and then obeyed. For the first time in Judah's history, a woman ruled alone. Athaliah declared herself Queen of Judah. She wasted no time, installed Baal priests, constructed altars to foreign gods in Jerusalem, and enforced pagan rituals with royal decree. The temple of the Lord stood cold and nearly forgotten, its doors beginning to rot under dust and disuse. She brought to Judah the spirit of Jezebel once again. It was not just power she craved, but control over worship, over truth, over memory. She wanted to rewrite the story of Judah without David, without Yahweh, and without resistance. But Athaliah did not know what God had already preserved. In the hush of the slaughter, amid the death and despair, a quiet rebellion was born. In a chamber hidden deep within the palace, Jehosheba, sister to King Ahaziah and wife of Jehoiada the high priest, acted with holy urgency. She had heard the orders. She had seen the soldiers move. But before they could reach the nursery where the infant prince lay, she slipped in through a servant's passage, her heart pounding like war drums. There, in a cradle of carved cedar, lay Joash, just a baby, his mother's eyes wide with fear and his tiny hand clutching a toy lion. Jehosheba scooped him into her arms and whispered, "You will not die today, little one, not while I still have breath." She did not run out through the gates. She carried him not to an army, not to a fortress, but to the safest place in all of Judah, the temple of the Lord. There, within the sacred courts, behind curtains, among the priests, the last surviving descendant of King David was hidden, not in a palace, not in a soldier's tent, but in the house of the God who had promised David, "Your throne shall be established forever." Joash was raised in secret. For 6 years Athaliah ruled. She walked the city in royal robes, basked in the silence of fear, and assumed she had won. But beyond the palace gates, behind temple walls, destiny breathed. A toddler learned to walk on stone floors, not palace rugs. He grew up hearing psalms, not pagan chants. He watched priests bow, not courtiers flatter. He was a king in hiding, growing under the gaze of God. And while Athaliah paraded on stolen authority, God watched from heaven, unmoved. The queen ruled the throne, but God preserved the crown. The temple courtyard glowed in golden silence, while the palace feasted and worshipped false gods. Within the walls of God's house, a different story was unfolding. One quiet enough to escape the queen's spies, yet divine enough to change the nation. Inside a secluded chamber near the inner court, Joash, the last surviving heir to David's throne, laughed. His small voice echoed softly off the temple stone. He was just a child, curious, wide-eyed, joyful. To him, the temple was not a secret hiding place. It was his home, his school, his kingdom in waiting. Josheba, his brave aunt, kept him close, her heart always half-anchored in prayer. She taught him songs of David, whispered stories of the Red Sea and the manna in the wilderness, and lit candles while telling him, "You are the child of promise. You are the light that survived the night." And by his side always stood Jehoiada, the high priest, an old man with a lion's courage and a prophet's resolve. Jehoiada saw the child not as an orphan but as a seed of hope. For 6 long years they raised him in secret, 6 years of watching from shadows, 6 years of quiet preparation, 6 years of hearing Athaliah's name spoken with fear in the streets. And yet not once did she suspect that the boy she had marked for death was growing within the very temple she had abandoned. Outside the temple the land was groaning. Athaliah's rule, though uncontested by force, was never loved. She surrounded herself with flatterers and pagan priests. She suppressed the name of Yahweh and promoted the worship of Baal across Judah. The people remembered the days of Jehoshaphat and Asa, when truth was spoken from the throne, and the God of Abraham was honored in the courts. Now under Athaliah even the hills were tainted with idolatry. But something stirred in the hearts of the faithful. Every year that passed they whispered, "Has God forgotten his promise to David?" In marketplaces old men reminded their grandchildren, "The Lord swore to David an oath he will not break. His line will continue. His kingdom will endure." In homes, mothers taught their children psalms under candlelight, quietly humming, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." And in the temple, hidden among holy scrolls, Joash grew. He was not raised in pride but in purpose. He was not fed on fear but on faith. Jehoiada trained him as both a prince and a worshiper. He showed him how to hold a sword, but more importantly, how to hold a scroll. He taught him the difference between ruling with fear and leading with righteousness. By the time Joash was 7, he knew his story. He knew the name Athaliah and what she had done. He knew his family had been slaughtered. He knew he was the last light of David's line. And he knew God was not finished. Far across the palace, Athaliah awoke in silk-covered rooms and sipped from cups of gold. Her face had aged, her power thickened by years of terror, but her arrogance remained untouched. She believed the kingdom was hers. She believed the line of David was dead. She believed her gods had won, but in the temple of the God she had forsaken, Joash was preparing to rise, and God, quiet, patient, eternal, was preparing a revolution in robes. It began with a whisper between trusted priests. Then a scroll passed in secret. Then the quiet gathering of warriors, not in armor, but in obedience. Jehoiada the high priest had waited long enough. For 6 years he watched evil rule from the palace, while righteousness grew in silence within the temple walls. Now Joash was 7, still a boy, but a boy anointed by promise and chosen by God. Jehoiada knew the time had come to reveal the hidden king, but this would not be a loud rebellion. No flags, no war horns, no marching armies. Instead, it would begin with a covenant, not just among warriors, but between God and his people. The high priest summoned the commanders of the royal guard, men still loyal to the house of David, Azariah, Ishmael, Maaseiah, Eliasaphat, brave men who had served before Athaliah's reign of terror. In the candlelit courts of the temple, Jehoiada spoke not with fear but with fire. "Behold, the king's son shall reign, as the Lord has said concerning the sons of David." The captains stood in stunned silence. Could it be? Could one of David's descendants truly have survived? Then Joash stepped forward, slight of stature but clothed in royal linen. There was something in his eyes, a light, a strength, not taught but inherited. The men dropped to one knee. They had not just seen a child, they had seen a king. Jehoiada's plan was precise. The guards were divided into 3 rotating shifts. On the appointed Sabbath, when troops changed posts and the city's attention was least suspecting, they would position themselves inside and around the temple. 1/3 would guard the palace gate. 1/3 would station at the foundation gate, 1/3 would surround the young king, shield in hand, sword at his side. Jehoiada armed the guards with spears and shields from King David's own arsenal, long preserved within the temple. It was a holy preparation, not just a military move, but a fulfillment of prophecy. The priest gathered the people, those who had not bowed to Baal, those who still remembered the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They came in droves, fathers, mothers, children, all sworn to silence, but burning with hope. And there, in the temple courtyard, before a crowd of trembling believers, Jehoiada anointed Joash with oil and placed a crown upon his head. Then he handed him the scroll of the covenant, the word of God. The priests lifted their voices, the people lifted their hands, and the trumpets shattered the morning sky. Long live the king! Long live the king! From her palace balcony, Athaliah heard the sound, a thunder of trumpets, the roar of celebration. It was not the chant of pagan festivals. It was not the dull murmur of temple rituals. It was a sound she hadn't heard in years, a cry of worship and hope. And it terrified her. She rushed down the corridor, robes flying, her crown tilting, her face twisted with rage. Past guards and servants, she reached the temple, and what she saw froze her in place. There he stood, a child, but not just a child, a king. Joash, the son she thought was dead, the last of David's line, crowned, praised, protected. She tore her robes, screamed in rage, and cried out, "Treason! Treason!" But the people did not echo her. They did not kneel. They did not run. They stood with swords, trumpets, and truth, and for the first time, Athaliah stood alone. The trumpets had not stopped. Their blast rolled across Jerusalem like a tidal wave, rattling windows and shaking hearts. In every corner of the city, ears turned toward the temple, where the sound of a long-awaited coronation rang out. The people came running, merchants, children, soldiers off duty, all drawn by the sound of hope reborn. What they found was not a seasoned warrior with years of conquest behind him, but a child. Crowned, anointed, guarded on every side. Joash stood firm, holding the scroll of the law in his hands as Jehoiada raised his voice over the people. "Behold the king, the son of David. The Lord has restored the throne." The Levites sang. The priests wept. The guards clashed their shields in rhythmic unison. But above them all, Athaliah's voice pierced the air like a dagger. "Treason! Treason!" Her scream echoed across the sacred court. Clad in royal purple, she pushed her way through the crowd until she stood before the platform, her face a twisted mask of disbelief and fury. She saw her grandson, alive. She saw the priests, her enemies. She saw the army, once hers, now turned against her. The people looked at her in silence, not with fear anymore, but with clarity. She was not their savior. She was not their queen. She was a thief of destiny. Athaliah's trembling fingers clawed at her robe as she turned wildly to the guards. But none moved to help her. She was no longer protected. She was unmasked. Jehoiada's voice thundered above the tension. "Do not slay her in the house of the Lord. Take her outside, by the horse gate." The guards obeyed. Without chains, without ceremony, Athaliah was dragged away from the temple. Through the city she had ruled with terror, past the walls where she had raised idols, down the path where David once danced before the ark of the Lord. The people did not cheer. They did not curse. They watched as justice moved silently, finally and fully. At the horse gate, just beyond the temple grounds, Athaliah was executed. The queen who had murdered children, who had claimed a throne not hers, who had tried to erase a covenant sealed in heaven, was gone. Back in the temple, the celebration continued, not with wild feasting, but with sacred reverence. Jehoiada gathered the people once more. He stood before them with Joash and said, "Let us make a covenant between ourselves and the Lord, and between the king and his people." And there, under the open sky and the lingering echoes of trumpets, a nation returned to its God. The altars of Baal were torn down, the pagan priests were removed, the temple was cleansed, and the throne of David stood again, not by force but by faith. Joash, though just 7, began his reign with righteousness and humility. He was guided by the wisdom of Jehoiada, the high priest who had risked everything to preserve the promise. And the people? They walked with light again. The streets rang with prayers, the temple doors swung wide, and Judah, after years of silence, sang again. The dust at the horse gate had barely settled. The woman who once ruled with cruelty, who called herself queen over Judah, now lay lifeless, a warning written in silence across the city walls. There were no statues to be toppled, no monuments to dismantle. Athaliah left no legacy worth preserving. Her name faded like smoke. But Joash, the boy she tried to kill, now sat enthroned, God's vengeance dressed in mercy. And beside him stood Jehoiada, whose white beard had seen more than most kings and whose loyalty had kept the line of David alive. In the days following Athaliah's death, Jerusalem felt as though it was waking from a long nightmare. The temple steps, once avoided, now welcomed the feet of worshippers. The Levitical choirs sang with voices that had been silenced for years. The sound of harp and trumpet filled the courtyards where Baal's smoke had once choked the air. With the authority of both priest and protector, Jehoiada led a national cleansing. He tore down the house of Baal, brick by brick. Its altars were broken, its images shattered, its priests slain. The people did not resist, they rejoiced. They were not just overthrowing a queen, they were returning to a king far greater. Jehoiada also appointed officials over the temple of the Lord, restoring the sacred rhythms of burnt offerings, peace offerings, and daily worship. Every law that had been trampled was lifted again. The word of the Lord was read aloud in public squares. A revival had begun. The people made a second covenant, not just between themselves and the king, but between the nation and the Lord. We will serve the Lord our God, and him only will we worship. For Joash, the weight of the crown did not crush him. He wore it not as a symbol of glory, but of gratitude. He walked the halls of the palace not as a boy above his people, but as a living testimony to the faithfulness of God. He would go on to repair the temple, restore its treasures, and lead Judah in righteousness, as long as Jehoiada lived to counsel him. And though he was young, the people followed him, because they had not just watched him grow, they had watched him survive. And Athaliah? History remembers her not as a queen, but as a warning. She tried to kill a promise. She tried to bury a covenant. She tried to erase the name of David from the earth. But the throne she claimed was not hers, and the destiny she defied was written in heaven. The story of Athaliah is not just about a wicked queen, it's about a God who keeps his word. It is the story of one child hidden in a temple while a nation groaned, of one woman's courage, Jehosheba, who defied her blood for the sake of truth, of one priest, Jehoiada, who believed that a dying flame could be fanned into fire, and of one throne, David's throne, preserved not by politics or armies, but by divine design. Centuries later, another child of David would be born, not hidden in a temple, but in a manger. Another rightful king, hunted by a jealous ruler, would be preserved. Another kingdom, not of this world, would rise, and his name is Jesus. The line of David continued, unbroken, unstoppable, eternal, because what God establishes, no enemy can destroy. Let this story remind you, no matter the schemes of darkness, God's promises will always prevail. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And if you want more powerful Bible stories like this one, stay tuned, because this channel is your home for truth, hope, and the word that never fails.